Have you published this elsewhere?
outmuslima.com published it. Yeah. I think Sadiq is saying we're live.
Oh, subhanAllah. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Justice for All Now. You can watch us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused network. It also broadcasts in Canada and Mexico. We're on 24/7 on Samsung Galaxy 19, on Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, and soon Apple TV. On average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. During 1 year, this equates to more than 10 million men and women. According to a report released by the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. This includes a range of behaviors, and in some cases might not be considered what we generally refer to as domestic violence. I'm going to go, we'll talk about some of these facts and figures with our guest today, who's joining us, and we're so grateful for her to be here, Hasna Mukhtar. Hasna is a writer, Fulbright alumna, and a PhD candidate at the Clark University. After graduating in 2015 with a master's in international development and social change, Hasna developed a passion for transdisciplinary approaches to addressing gender-based violence in Muslim communities. Her research, writing, and activism focus on amplifying the voices of Muslim women and tackling the injustices of gendered violence. Hasna is a storyteller at heart. In 2006, she worked as a journalist in Arab News, and later her articles appeared in several publications, including Fortune, Yahoo, Bustle, and Alt Muslima. You can read her work at hasnamukhtar.com. Currently, Hasna is associated with the Peaceful Families Project, and we're ever so grateful for them for connecting us with her. We welcome Hasna, and most of all, Hasna is a survivor of domestic violence. Assalamu alaikum, Hasna.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much for being here today. Alhamdulillah. Reading your story, mashallah, such an inspiration, so much strength. And I just would like you to let our audience, know about you. Who are you and what is your journey?
First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's really wonderful to connect with you, Hannah. I am really, as you mentioned, I'm currently in my final years of doing my PhD work. My research focuses on gender-based violence, which is a topic that I've carried on with me, not because of the degree itself, but because it stems from my own personal experience. Growing up, I have been subjected to domestic violence, physical, spiritual, psychological, in so many forms. And when you grow up in a sheltered environment and there's no access to information, there's no access to resources, and all you know is your limited experience, there's not much you can do basically except for doubt your own, what your heart is telling you about what you're going through. And then, of course, there's definitely the familiar and the cultural pressure of trying to, twist some of these experiences into having to justify or to kind of legitimize what abuse and what not is abuse. And so, alhamdulillah, I'm in a much better place right now, having gone through a lot of seeking help for myself, because I don't think I would be able to do this work if it wasn't for the healing the journey of healing that I've been through. And so, yeah, my role, basically working with Peaceful Families Project, my research as a mother of two young boys, and as someone, I carry this work in my heart. I do it for a living, but I also do it because I know what it feels like to be there. And in my mission and pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I want to help other women. I want to continue to create awareness. I want to understand more. I mean, one thing that I've learned through the past couple of years in my PhD program, that violence is not a black and white thing. It's a very complex, complicated issue that requires us to have a lot of nuance and understanding of the multiple forces and multiple intersections of systems of oppression, of beliefs and ideas that continue to perpetuate that kind of thinking.
So let's, I would like you first to start off with the Muslim community. Can you share with us what sort of, a lot of times we tend to live in a bubble and we think that these issues don't affect us. And people who write about these issues or bring them up to light are often sort of, thrown to the side. People consider them, oh, these are just feminist views, or people, this is beyond Islamic terminology. There's no such thing as domestic violence in Islamic terminology. I've had that, lobbed at me many times. So where do we stand in the Muslim community in the United States? And you can talk globally as well, but I'd like to concentrate perhaps North America. Where do we stand? What are the numbers like?
Well, according to a survey that Peaceful Families Project, in partnership with the Sakina Project, they've done in 2011. I mean, it's a little bit outdated, but currently there's work to kind of create an updated version of that survey. 801 respondents have responded to the survey. So 2 out of 3, which is basically 66% of Muslims who took the survey, knew a Muslim who had been physically abused. That's a really large percentage. And among those who identified as community leaders, 80% said they knew also a Muslim had been abused. In terms of the people who have been abused themselves, over half of the survey respondents, like 53%, said they were abused themselves at one point of their life, which means that 1 out of every 2 Muslims have been subjected to any kind of abuse. And so these are, like, considering like it's 800 respondents only, it's such a large and alarming number and statistics. Like, imagine if we took that survey nationally, we asked a lot more people. I mean, that was a national survey, but I mean, encouraged more people to kind of come forward and respond. I think these numbers speak for themselves. And again, this is the 2011 survey. So I'm sure if we do this again now, we're going to have even more shocking statistics about the prevalence of domestic violence within the Muslim community.
And a lot of people don't. Let's define what we're talking about. So let's define domestic violence. How does the organization that you work for define it, and in your studies?
Yeah. So domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behaviors used by one person to gain and maintain power and control over another person in the household. So domestic violence usually refers directly to any kind of abuse that happens within the household. It could be physical, beating, hurting somebody, throwing stuff at people. It could be verbal or emotional, psychological, like using demeaning words, swearing at somebody, making someone over criticizing somebody. It could be spiritual as well, using religion to put somebody down, to condemn them, to kind of shame them or make them feel bad about themselves. Economic, it could be withholding finances. If somebody is dependent financially on their partner or somebody in the household, you withhold money or finances from that person. You basically hold them hostages in the house, mobility, you prevent them from leaving the house, not take care of them, or if they need health, caring. So these are all the different multiple forms of abuse. Sexual, of course, that's the most important one. I forgot. Like, one of the biggest things is marital rape. A a lot of misunderstanding about the marriage within Islam is that a man is allowed to kind of have sex with his wife anytime he pleases to, even if that's against her will, but that's not the case, So that's identified as sexual violence. So it comes in many different forms. The term is used interchangeably with intimate partner violence, or IPV. IPV is basically physical or sexual abuse again, but it happens within two people in a relationship, and they don't have to necessarily live together. So they could be either together or apart. But domestic violence usually happens within people living in the same household.
Okay. And so is the work guided by Islamic scholarship? Is that this is a question that is often asked. So a lot of the times Muslim organizations who are doing this work, is that work guided by Islamic scholarship?
I mean, the main reason why PFP, or Peaceful Families Project, started in 2000 by Sharifa Khatib, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless her heart, she passed away, is basically to address this gap of we need to provide an understanding of the problem and tools and trainings and awareness through an Islamic paradigm. Mm-hmm. And I know also Heart to Women and Girls, who's based in Chicago, they've also started their work a few years ago, but they also maintain the same thing. They're Muslim-centric, so what that means is that they use the teachings of Islam to kind of spread awareness and send that message out. So mainstream services usually kind of take a secular approach, but we as a faith-based organization that addresses domestic violence, we make it a priority to use an Islamic paradigm to address the problem. And I think from my personal experience is that I lost my faith at one point and my relationship to Allah because of the violence. Because when it's shoved down your throat as take it because that's what Islam says, you kind of start to have these questions about, does really God allow for such injustice to happen? Mm-hmm. But then, alhamdulillah, and I thank only Allah for that, going back, and also the work of a lot of Muslim women and feminists who have been doing and providing a lot of resources, interpretations, and books, and trying to challenge these ideas, that I've managed to find my way back to Islam and to Allah. And so I think it's important to kind of center that in the work that we continue to do.
And what is the actual work? So what do Muslim organizations that are dealing with or confronting domestic violence, what are some of the work that is being done?
So usually domestic violence or violence in general, there's two major themes. So there's intervention, which is basically providing services right directly to the survivors or the victims who are experiencing violence, such as you want to help somebody leave an abusive marriage. You want to stop somebody from getting harmed. You want to provide other means of services like legal advocacy, a medical advocacy if somebody's raped. Like how do they go about that? How do they, if they want to seek a legal file charges? All of these things. These are kind of considered intervention. Prevention is more generally the work that is being done in the community to raise awareness, to make people understand more of what is domestic violence and ways to address it. And within Peaceful Families Project, that part is done through one of the niche programs that we do, which is the Imams Trainings Program, Imams and Chaplains Program. And basically, that is, again, part of what the founder, Sharifa Khatib, has done, is to she found that there is a need to train those imams in mosques, because most often Muslim women in the United States would go and disclose their abuse to the imams, seeking some help or validation. And unfortunately, imams are not equipped or trained to offer the support that the women needed. That's number one. Number two, some of the imams themselves, they have the wrong ideas about what is domestic violence. And sometimes they even, they have no idea what domestic violence is probably. And then they end up harming the women, re-traumatizing the women, or maybe abusing the women themselves by just, not listening to them or not being able to identify the urgent solution at that particular moment. So
I wanted to point out just a bit about Sister Sharifa. So she was one of our the work that we have done in the past has been Bosnia Task Force, and Sister Sharifa was on the task force and has been, mashallah, her legacy, may Allah bless her. She was one of the people who worked with the task force in getting rape declared a war crime. So this is, as people are watching, this is something to remember, and please keep her in your du'as. So go back to, inshallah.
Yeah, I mean, so these are the two general, I mean, in terms of intervention and even prevention, I mean, there are emerging, we have a directory as well. I want to point people to that we recently put out that lists all the names of the organizations that are doing, addressing violence in different forms within the Muslim community in North America. So I think we have a good amount of organizations that are doing a lot of amazing work on the ground. I mean, but we still need more. Mainstream services are there for others to go to. But as I said earlier, you know, a cultural and religious understanding that these Muslim organizations bring into the conversation and how to address the problem is kind of unique.
So, and you were talking about the Imam's Toolkit. What all is in the toolkit?
This toolkit that we recently launched during the COVID when it happened, because, you know, when everything shut down, unfortunately for us who we're in safe homes, it meant that we're shielding and sheltering from the possibility of getting the virus. But for a lot of other people who are in already abusive and dangerous situations, being locked inside the home with no way to go out, it means that the chances of you getting subjected to more abuse, your life gets threatened, you know, it just kind of escalated basically. And there was a lot of reporting of increased numbers due to COVID-19 that, you know, more abuse is happening. And also on the other hand,
a little bit more about that was one of the reasons why we wanted to have this show as well, is because of the situation we're in right now. Could you share some of those, like how much has it risen? Have your calls that have been coming in risen?
We as an organization don't make direct intervention services, so we don't get calls. But I mean, reading through the headlines and the news and seeing what's happening, I mean, we definitely there is a spike in numbers in terms of you know, people reporting, and also, you know, the fact that it's not as easy to kind of seek help, leave the house. I mean, it created more obstacles. There were already a lot of barriers for women to leave abusive situations. COVID and the lockdown even created more barriers for them. And so the Imam Toolkit was basically a way of trying to have imams and service providers of ways to kind of connect with these women. How do you know, because face-to-face interaction is different when then you're talking to somebody through a screen. How do you respect the boundaries? How do you make sure you're with everything, because it's overwhelming as well, you know, on so many levels. How do you make sure you understand and cater to the needs of the person you're talking to? So basically, it's just a lot of tips and a lot of tools that can use by imams and service providers in connecting with women that they're seeking help.
So what are some of the tips for those who might be listening today and haven't had, you know, we're sharing the toolkit in comments and also on the screen, and you can go to Peaceful Family Project to get the toolkit as well. But would you like to share some tips?
I mean, one of the things that we've heard a lot about from imams is that, you know, unfortunately, people think that imams just are available 24/7 to address issues. And so that kind of creates a burnout sometimes for imams. And one of the things that, for example, that I was put there is that they need, and especially with COVID, now that people are home, people think that, you know, the imam is accessible 24/7 now, even more. So the person has to evaluate whether they're in the right mind frame to kind of talk to somebody who's experiencing abuse, and how does that energy feel. And other than that, it's more like the typical things that you normally would do. Withhold judgment, you know, do not judge somebody for whatever, you know, choices that they make, whether they leave or stay, whatever happens, you know, we have to approach this work with a lot of compassion and withholding judgment. I mean, unfortunately, we absorb a lot of the stereotypes around survivors and the victims, like, why is she staying? Why did she dress that way? And these are all like victim blaming tactics that I use to kind of blame the person who is being hurt and harmed rather than holding the person who's doing the harm accountable. And so, I mean, the Prophet ﷺ said in hadith, and that's something that we constantly use at PFP, is that help your brother or your sister, whether they're oppressed or oppressor. So we know how to help the oppressed, but how will you help the oppressor is by stopping them from causing harm. Mm-hmm. And the general framework of Islam does not accept oppression in any form or shape. So this is something, so you withhold judgment, you deal with compassion. You also like read the body language or the voice, like you read somebody's voice if they're talking to them. Are they in danger? Because sometimes people are in danger, but they cannot speak. If your abuser is with you, you have to learn and be attentive to the ways that they're trying to tell you something. Their body language. That's something else to keep in mind. And always like take care of yourself as someone who is, trying to support others. You take care of yourself and your well-being and your energy so that you are at your best. And because when we're at our best, we're able to cater to the needs of those around us better.
So, since you began your work, has anything substantially changed in the amount of domestic violence reports that you have seen? Or how has the work changed over the past, perhaps since this survey was taken in 2011? How has the community response changed?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't been with PFP for that long. I just came like a couple of months ago with them. But I know from just reading and learning and through my doctoral research is that unfortunately the numbers are going up and they're not going down in terms of the cases. And that could be mainly to the fact that there's more reporting. There's always been the issue of domestic and intimate partner violence happening. But luckily, due to the work of a lot of people and a lot of advocates and a lot of organizations and highlighting the issue and shedding the light on it, women are coming forward. Women have more resources to report, to seek out help. So for the numbers to go up, it's not necessarily that they're increasing, but that they may be increasing, but there's also like more reporting happening and conversation. In terms of the response of people, there is more awareness, definitely. There is more discussion happening, but we need to do more. I mean, it's still not enough. I'm often, told that I talk about this too. I'm such a feminist. But it's not, it has nothing to, like, it is about being a feminist, but it's also about human dignity and respecting human life. I mean, Dr. Ingrid Madison started this project called the Hurma Project. I'm not sure if you know of it.
Yeah.
And she speaks so eloquently about how Islam values human life. And so if we want to kind of think from that framework, from that perspective, we need to honor our religion by responding to that and having discussions around what is it exactly happening in our communities. Why do so many women experience violence? How do we start to change? And it's not just a matter of addressing individual cases. We need to start to change the systems that we live through. Ideas about what femininity and what masculinity are, what is acceptable, what is acceptable for a man and what is acceptable for women. Rahma, the idea of rahma in a household, and that's like a big concept in our religion in relationships. So we talk about this and we have khutbahs about this all the time, but when it comes to actual application and relationships, we see a lot different reality, and the numbers, tell us that there is a problem of violence within our community.
We often hear about domestic violence against women and even children, generally, and especially in the Muslim community. Yet, what does domestic violence look like against men?
In terms of Muslim men, I'm not sure. I don't have any current specific. Maybe they're there, but I haven't. It's not my interest to look into them right now because I'm more concerned with women. But according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, approximately 1 in 10 men experience violence. But again, that's not to minimize that the violence happens to men, but women are by far the most impacted by violence when it happens, definitely. And men, unfortunately, are by far the abusers and the perpetrators of violence.
Okay. And so this is something when you study. So what exactly are you studying? What is the scope of your PhD?
So my work centers around international development. And by international development, I mean all these projects that are carried by the United Nations and similar organizations around the world to kind of intervene in certain local communities and try to implement programs and create change around violence, for example. So trying to look at that and trying to take a feminist perspectives and trying to think through the different intersecting systems. Like, let's talk about colonialism, let's talk about capitalism, let's talk about sexism and racism, and how do these all intersect and shape the experiences of Muslim women. But my geographical focus is basically on the Arab Gulf region, considering that I come from the region, and there is a detrimental gap in the literature in English language about this particular topic in that region. But I've also simultaneously, I've done some research on, when I was living in Worcester, Massachusetts, I've done research in collaboration with my psychology professor, Dr. Nicole Overstreet, on the barriers that prevent women from accessing domestic violence services. And we've interviewed a lot of Muslim women. And so that is part of kind of gives me some information about what's happening within the North American sphere. And of course, also reading a lot of the literature and a lot of the books and the studies that have been conducted in North America.
So what have you found what are the barriers?
I mean, definitely one of the biggest barriers for Muslim women have been the stereotyping around, especially when they're seeking services from mainstream providers, about religion and culture. So you come from a certain culture, therefore you are always, by assumption, you're a victim of violence. You follow Islam, therefore your partner or whoever abused you is violent. So these, unfortunately, are very much prevalent. So Islamophobia is real for a lot of these women, and it kind of hinders a lot of women from moving, disclosing the abuse. So in my research, I feel like we're stuck between two ends. On the one end, we have the patriarchy or the sexism and the violence and all of these, systems that kind of perpetuate violence against Muslim women and ideas. And then you have on the other end, Islamophobia and white supremacy and all that, the ideas that kind of also contribute under racism as well. I mean, recently, Dr. Bumi Oyewa Gasakia, assistant professor at Northern Illinois University, she gave a webinar at Peaceful Families Project, and her research basically focuses on the experience of Black Muslim women in America with violence. And it was such an eye-opening and much-needed work because, first of all, there's barely nothing out there about the experiences of Black Muslim women in particular. She talked about the intersection of religion, race, and gender within this domestic violence problem. And in citing one of the experiences of one of the women, I'm just going to read that quote because it was really powerful. She says, "Growing up in racism, part of slavery, pain was very real for us. Being hit, being hurt, being tortured. You cannot fall apart because of that. We cannot direct it necessarily at the people that are doing it to us." So you see the line of intergenerational trauma here because of slavery that they carry. I mean, it just kind of, you're stuck in an abusive situation. You are in pain, but you take it in because you can't report the person because you know what's going to happen to them. And it's just so powerful to see how, even that we do understand in general what causes domestic violence, people's different experiences are different, definitely, because of the different forces of violence that they get subjected to.
So this leads to me to, I'm sorry to cut you off, but it leads me to a question, especially considering right now we're talking about defunding the police, we're talking about, so what are your recommendations to maybe neighbors or families who know that there may be a domestic violence situation, should people call the police, especially considering, so we'll talk about Muslims in general, especially in a post 9/11 era where Muslim men are often perceived as terrorist or dangerous or radical, and even if just for sporting a sunnah beard, right? And so what are your recommendations? How does this impact them if police are called during a domestic abuse case? And then if we could also talk about specifically Black Muslims, because then they are at the intersection of race and Islamophobia.
I'd like to start with the Black Muslims first, because I think it's important.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, again, going to Dr. Bumi, who I just mentioned her work. She really critiqued the over-reliance on the criminal justice system in general and the policing, because it really has lethal consequences, as we can see, for Black people. And there's this idea that by calling the police, we're going to solve the problem. But unfortunately, it's just like, when there is like grave danger for somebody's life, okay, fine. But on the long term, calling the police, putting somebody in prison, that's not helping addressing the root causes of the problem of violence. So we need to think about alternative solutions. Like, what are there, like, ideas and different techniques and different spaces and different systems that we can create that can change that behavior, but at the same time, it's not the police. Mm-hmm. I mean, the whole Black Lives Matter right now is all about defunding the police, because the police is basically subjecting Black people to more violence than it's not going away. So we want to think of the police as the only option when we see somebody's life is in danger, maybe somebody who's about to lose their life, think of that. Other than that, I think if we're talking generally, if you have a neighbor, if you have a relative, ask them, like, if you see something, approach them and talk to them, first of all, withhold judgment. And second of all, listen to the person, what are they telling you? Don't pressure people into leaving or staying. It's their choice. It's their life. One of the first things that they taught me when I was trained for serving on the hotline at Pathways for Change in Worcester, Massachusetts, is that they tell us, when somebody is subjected to violence, their power to make decisions for their lives, their power is taken away from them. So when you try to be there for them, you don't want to impose your own ideas or opinions on them. You just try to listen and cater to their needs, because you want to try to give them that power back that's been taken and hijacked and violated. So try to listen and connect somebody. If you know of the resources, connect the person with domestic violence resources. They can do like something called safety planning with a social worker, where they go step by step on the options available. There are shelters, available also for people to leave. And again, these are not options for everybody. There is no one solution that fits everybody. Each case by case is different, and we have to take that in consideration. So I also think, like, Muslim imams, they have an obligation to discuss this within the khutbahs and then every Friday, like, talk about these issues and try to challenge people to pay attention to everybody around them. Do you see somebody who has suddenly disappeared from coming to the mosque? Do you know of someone who has a history of, black bruises on their body, whatever? Do you know? You have to just be conscious. God knows, and I don't say that because I want to brag, but not even through my work. I have a lot of women who find in me in secrecy, and I just continue to try my best to be there non-judgmentally, because sometimes all they need is somebody just to listen to them, somebody who can tell them that they're not crazy, because more than often gaslighting within violence makes somebody doubt their own sanity, and so just compassion and listen and ask about, somebody and try to reach out to them if they're in any situation. One of the biggest obstacles. Yeah, go ahead, Penny. Sorry.
I wanted to ask if at that point, do you give resources? How is this? What is a safe way to give resources without taking someone's power away from them, but also giving them options or showing them options that they might not have access to because of the situation they're in?
Yeah. Ask them, how can I be of help to you? if they show any kind of interest in talking to somebody, then you find the local, the hotline number or the local organization that is willing to talk to them. Or maybe sometimes you can go and speak on their behalf and try to see what is the, sometimes people are in dangerous situations. They can't even call a hotline or they can't even leave. So if they give you that authority to act on their behalf, meet with someone, ask them what are the options, and try to do that safety planning for them. I mean, it's just being attentive to somebody and being there for them. When children are involved, of course, it becomes even a bigger problem, because then what happens to the kids? What is this financial resources that somebody can use to support their life? I mean, if somebody's working, then that gives them a little bit of dependence. But sometimes, the woman is relying on the partner to kind of to survive economically. I've done once an assignment during my work, and it says homelessness is a big threat for women who are stuck in domestic violence situations, because they can't leave. And if they leave, they end up being on the streets. So,
and this is true. We see this Muslimat al-Nisa is in our backyard, and one of the struggles is from the community is actually support for the center, but just the amount of people or the amount of women who come to Muslimat al-Nisa because of the lack of other places that Muslim women can go to, especially in this region. So this is something that is, the homelessness that you were talking about is. And so what making that decision between homelessness, or can you also talk a little bit about like the after leaving being a dangerous time for women as well, because that a lot of times that's what that's the time when a lot of times the community hears about it, because somebody passed away because they found the strength to leave. So is that a pattern?
Say that again, Hannah, sorry.
So I was talking about the time after someone finds the power within themselves to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you could talk about that, is that a pattern for that to be dangerous, that time to be dangerous for them?
Of course, it's the most dangerous time, that the risk that the person is taking to leave that abuse, because if they're going to somewhere and they know that the partner or the person that they've been abusing them, they're going to look for them, then it becomes like you're living daily in kind of trying to protect yourself from being found out, from trying to be tracked down. And so many cases have happened when the abuser eventually they track down the person and they either hurt them badly or they just kill them. And it's just happened so many times. And unfortunately, it's just, we need to wake up to the dangers of that. Like somebody losing their life because they left an abusive person, instead of having to challenge that person and try to tell them, you hold them accountable and try to tell them this is not acceptable. So it is definitely, and it ranges differently. Some people, they might not be aware of what they're going through is abuse, and once they know, they just pick up and leave. There are other people, it takes them long. And keep in mind that the abuser is somebody who's always probably have a relationship with, somebody you love, somebody who you have some good memories with, even too sometimes, So it's not an easy decision, and we have to be patient with these women unless there is a risk for their lives. I mean, even with that, there's not much you can do. Sometimes women decide to leave and then they change their mind. Sometimes they want to stay for their kids. Sometimes, as I said, for economic reason. It's a very difficult and complicated decision. So, and it depends, each woman, each person, according to their life or their mental health situation as well. Sometimes, as I said, gaslighting from the abuser makes the person get to a point where they doubt everything and every step in their life. And so to get to that point, I mean, there has to be a lot of support and a lot of patience as well for somebody to leave the abuse.
So support needed from the immediate family, support needed from the community, and just generally society as well. What are some of if you have any idea of some structural changes within the communities that can help Muslim families? For example, are there any efforts to change laws, particularly when it comes to discrimination or racism once someone leaves, or even as a family is going through this situation? I'm just trying to think of things that can, if there are ways that people can get involved in this advocacy for victims, for survivors, as well as families?
I mean, structurally, we need to start by having conversations within our communities about the problem itself and be honest about it. Because one of the biggest problems is that we continue to deny that it actually exists. You know, the minute you bring up domestic, that does not, because in fear of Islamophobia, we kind of deny that domestic violence is happening. But we can do both at the same time. It doesn't have to be one or the other. We can combat Islamophobia, but we can also critique the problem of domestic violence within our communities. So start to have these conversations, and every time in as I said, in mosques, in community gatherings, you know, let's talk about it as an issue, and let's talk about what causes domestic violence. One of the prevalent ideas of that we have is that a man is better than a woman in some capacity. Unfortunately, that is something that is kind of have been perpetuated, but unfortunately, a lot of scholars and a lot of imams who are very patriarchal in their ideas. And so we need to kind of see, where does that stem from? So when we're talking about violence, there, as you mentioned, there's structural and there is the intimate part. The intimate violence and interpersonal violence, I mean, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens due to the structural violence, due to the ideas of sexism. Men are better than women. It's okay for a man to discipline his wife. I don't know what, like, women cannot be seen in discussions about women's clothing and whatever they choose to wear. All these ideas contribute to this continuing to dehumanize women, to think of them as less than. And that kind of creates a culture and a society ripe for, adopting these violent behaviors to kind of put the woman in her place. So we need to challenge that. Let's talk about that. And again, I go back to, let's think of alternatives to policing and laws, Hannah, there's so many laws. And again, there's a lot of big debate and discussion about something called carceral feminism, which is basically, we think about policing and the laws as the only solution for violence, but it's not. Research of a lot of women that I've read, there's a really good book by Dr. Samina Mullah. It's called the Violence of Care. She basically looks at, medical care and the policing system and how that interacts with women who are subjected to violence, and that re-traumatizes them. The whole legal process of women, going through the courts, and that is like a continuing wound that continues to happen. And eventually, the ideas of evidence and whatnot. We need to, one thing that I probably should have started with is, like, we need to believe women when they come forward. Believe them. How many times have we heard about women making up this stuff? Maybe 1 in a million? So every time something like this happens, it ends up being true. It ends up with someone losing their life. So let's start to believe with the women. Yes, legal reform is needed, but legal reform, when we have laws in the books and then we don't change the actual fabric of our community and the actual ideas that are continuing to perpetuate violence, there's no point. Holding people accountable. I was just having a discussion today with a friend of mine, and we're talking about, and then again, it goes back to personal preference for survivors and victims. But as I continue to do this healing work, it's fine that, okay, let's put people in prison and to hold them accountable. But then how is that changing the community again? The framework of restorative justice is actually becoming more and more like appealing to me and to this friend that we were having the discussion. I want a solution that can actually create shift and changes in the person who have committed the crime, to regret that what they've done and to continue to fight themselves and their demons not to do it again. Put them in jail, fine, but then give them an alternative where they can actually reflect on the harm they've done. And then they can...
I think in interfaith circles too, I was actually at a domestic violence conference a couple of years ago, and that was something the panelists all were discussing from different faith traditions, was that bringing back people into the church or bringing back people into the temple or the masjid who have been abusers, and now putting them in situations where they can work towards changing themselves. And that is something that at first was some of the people, especially the Muslim women in the audience, who were like, well, we're not even at step 1 where we're recognizing what domestic violence is, or that this is wrong. And so to have this conversation about, but it was very interesting to learn from the experiences of other faith communities and where they're at now, because they've had longer road talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. Another thing, Hannah, I think that is really important is the center of survivors' voices. Sometimes, unfortunately, when we're doing this work, we kind of tend to forget why we're actually doing it, because there are so many pieces that we have to work with. Getting funding to support our work, maintaining public presence, getting programming out there. But we kind of tend to forget that we need to listen to survivors in shaping the work that we do. Because when somebody comes in and says, this has been my experience and I think this is what should be done, we need to listen to them, because you cannot envision a solution and for the future, for addressing a problem without listening to somebody who actually experienced that problem. So I think centering survivors' voices and trauma-informed approaches to addressing the problem as well, rather than just having this one general idea of what it should look like and then just going from that.
So, and that's, what you said right there is trauma informed choices. What does that look like for the abuser?
I think of, when I think of abusers and perpetrators, all this vocabulary to me is very limited. I'm not a big fan of the words victims and survivors, because they're very limiting and very narrow, because it's more complicated than one or the other. But I think just one of the things that we could look at in terms of perpetrators, and I've seen that in my own situation, is that what's this, nobody's born and they become an abuser tomorrow, like the next day, There is either, ideas, as I said, like wrong gender stereotyping about who should be the leader of the household and how to go about that. There is the religious component of normalizing this kind of behavior and justifying it through religion. There is, but there's also other factors, and sometimes that can exacerbate the problem, like mental health issues, economic issues, immigration status. These things you have to have that whole holistic approach to addressing the problem. Saying that does not absolve the person of the harm they've done. They need to, and again, I go back to saying this is each person who has been a victim of violence, look at it differently. There are women who want to see their abusers punished, and they have every right to. But there are women who want to see change happen, and so that's where an alternative idea of, as I said, restorative justice come into place. How can we hold these people accountable so that they can recognize what they've done is wrong? And how do we give them the tools and the space and the resources that they can transform themselves? At the end of the day, you cannot force somebody into change, right? Like, we put people in prison, and at the end of the day, they come out and they perpetuate the same violence they've done. You cannot force anybody to change, but the person has to want that change to happen in the first place. And the other thing is, we have to have a communal accountability system in place. How many times have we recently heard of imams who have been perpetrators themselves, big religious figures who have been perpetrators themselves? And what have we done? The first reaction to that is that we say, no, they're okay. We start to defend them, and we start to call other people kafirs, and the women are liars and all of that. And it's just, it doesn't make any sense. Who are we committed to? Justice or to public figures? Which is the priority here? Allah commanded us to help the oppressed by stopping them from committing oppression and abuse. So we have to set our priorities right. And I'm thinking that happens by having more conversations around this, by centering the issue. And it shouldn't be just the work of organizations who are dedicated to domestic violence, who are led mostly by women. We need to have more men also come and start their own. I don't want to diminish anybody's work. There has been some of that happening, but we need more to come on board.
Sharpens steel, iron sharpens iron. That's something that we do, that is, and having that accountability in our circles, and face it, Muslim men tend to move in Muslim men circles much more, and Muslim women, there is that segregation of the genders. So, and having that, this is like zero tolerance, what sort of change does that bring? The brotherhood, what does brotherhood mean? What do what does sisterhood mean? So there is a lot of, like, I feel like a lot of times, yes, there is how we will look at the issue through an Islamic lens, and using that terminology to bring about, as you guys work on peaceful families, because that's the ultimate goal, right? You don't want to destroy a family necessarily because of what we might think is the best solution for them, but to actually bring, and that's something that I have seen too. I've seen people talk about anger management classes and circles of healing for men who themselves have been victims of violence, and that's all they've learned all their lives as well, is that violence. So no, this was a fabulous, fascinating conversation, because we touched on many other things that a lot of times we don't think about when we think about domestic abuse. It's very binary, it's just like, this is, so thank you so much for bringing that in. And as we wrap up, we have about 30 seconds. If you would like to give some advice to our audience as they're listening in, if there is anybody who's going through the situation as if they're listening in.
I just want to end up by saying, Hannah, that, in a reflection piece I wrote recently, I've grappled a lot with the Quran in terms of trying to come in an understanding of, like, if this, patriarchy and violence is a modern day issue. But I honestly don't think that is. And I've been reading the Quran, and I've been reflecting on the stories of Fir'aun. I've been reflecting on how the non-believers have called God and his angels as feminine in a way to demean them. And the third piece about the son preference. And it's all like verses in the Quran that clearly speak to the mentality of looking at women as less than, looking at somebody who's not Arab, not white, not all of that. And that's like, Dr. Aziz al-Hibri goes back to the original sin of, when Satan said to Adam, I'm not going to bow to Adam because I am created from fire and he's from clay. And that's the original of all of this. I am better than him or her because I'm white. I'm better than him or her because I'm a woman. I'm better than him or her because I'm Arabi and they're not. So we really think about, when you think about that, I think it just kind of puts things into perspective. This is not a modern day problem. It has always existed, but I think we have reached a stage where it just kind of is becoming really alarming, and we need to pay attention to that. As Muslims, we have an obligation, we have a duty to stop that from happening in so many levels.
Well, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for being here and being a part of this conversation. Inshallah, hopefully we can have you back. And Jazakallah khair for our audience to be here. We've run out of time, but thank you for watching us. You're watching us on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum.